Good morning. Welcome to the Book Blast podcast. This morning we're with Philip Mansel, whose book King of the World, The Life of Louis XIV, is out with Penguin on July the 11th. So thank you for coming, Philip.
Good morning, Georgia.
A bit of background. History is your thing. Why not write historical fiction as opposed
Which
to...
I adore, and I adored Dumas, Alfred Duggan's medieval historical novels. Aragon's La Semaine Sainte is wonderful. And novels can, of course, tell you so much about motivation. Like Sybil Bedford's A Legacy is surely the best book written on the Germany of Wilhelm II. But I also find the truth more interesting than fiction, and the richness of sources for French history, the way everybody is scribbling away in their attics about what they've just done in the day. Not only Saint-Simon's memoirs, which aren't very reliable, but the diary of the Marquis de Soch, the memoirs of Madame de Motteville, the letters of Madame de Sévigné. They're first rate.
And you are known in particular as an historian of the 19th century specialising in France and the Middle East, with such notable works under your belt as Constantinople, City of the World's Desire, 1453 to 1924, Paris Between Empires, 1814 to 1852, Levant, Splendour and Catastrophe in the Mediterranean, and Aleppo, the rise and fall of Syria's great merchant city. Why now the 17th century and Louis XIV?
Well, there's a huge revival of interest in Versailles and Louis XIV. Look at all the programmes. In fact, I think the science of Versaillology is going to be as popular as Egyptology. And I love writing about French history and the role of France in Europe. So when my publisher suggested I do Louis XIV, I jumped on it.
And to what extent, actually, has history writing changed since your first book, A Life of Louis XVIII, came out in 1981?
Well, I think there's much more awareness of the role of women, of course, much more awareness of global interconnections, the way Louis XIV is thinking about Siam and China and America as well as Europe, and much more availability, much easier to do detailed archival research with the help of the internet. And archives are more accessible and more keener to help historians than they were when I started.
And also has more material. I mean, how often does new material come to light, or how every...
More material from Spain, for example, his correspondence with his grandson, the King of Spain. I don't think actually there's more material, because France has always had wonderful archives, and some of the best books on Louis XIV were written in the 1860s or 1870s when they published the works of Colbert or a book on Louvois.
The book Sultans in Splendour, Monarchs of the Middle East, 1869 to 1945, The Court of France, 1789 to 1830, and Dress to Rule, Royal and Court Costume from Louis XIV to Elizabeth II focus specifically on the importance of power dressing and court and manners. And, how much did all that matter then? I mean, obviously it was important in terms of diplomacy, I guess, pomp, pageantry, but then and now...
Then was incredibly important. It goes very close to Louis as a man. He actually often wore quite simple blue coats or brown coats. But when there's a ceremony like the reception of an ambassador or a royal wedding, then he's encrusted with jewels like the image of a Madonna. And this very last ceremony, receiving the Persian ambassador, February 1715, he's about 78. He walks with this jewel-encrusted coat close to the crowd so they can see the splendour better. So he's very aware that, in his opinion, people judge by outward appearances.
And today, though, therefore, the similar look at Princess Diana. Is it the couturier? Because I'm trying to relate now to today. That was then, but now. I mean, how, in your view?
Yes, think of the amount of money into the hands of London dressmakers Royal Ascot puts every year. It must
royal weddings.
And royal weddings. The way Kate Middleton's dress was imitated the moment it appeared on television in the sweatshops of China. They were watching television and copying her wedding dress. And then...
Meghan Markle is a bit of a style.
And Meghan Markle also. Yeah. Then the clothes industry is one of the biggest industries in Paris, and the court is very conscious of helping it by having these ceremonies. And even before him, in the 16th century was Venice, and then as Paris really takes off as a global city, everybody's coming to Paris, and the court is encouraging the dress industry. And there's this illustrated magazine which is subsidized by the court and has fashion prints that go round the world from the 1670s on. And even now,
an early version of Vogue.
Yes, even now, some of the biggest French fortunes are to do with the luxury trade. Think of L'Oréal and Madame Bettencourt.
Were there designers or names under Louis XIV, the clothes trade, if it was so important? Who made, for example, the jewel-encrusted garment you refer to?
Curiously enough, the names of the male tailors aren't really very prominent. They're just a fashionable tailor.
They're sort of lackeys, really.
They're lackeys,
well
yes.
Treated, probably.
The person who, well, I'm sure they made a lot of money. The person who is really important is the man, a position invented by Louis XIV called the Grand Maître de la Garde-robe du Roi, the Grand Master of the Wardrobe of the King, his friend the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, who really runs the King's clothes, which are kept on the ground floor of Versailles. Later, under Marie Antoinette, you have this very famous dressmaker called Rose Bertin.
So that was marked the beginning, one could argue, of the sort of couturier names. Yes, so Louis. So how long did it take you to research and write King of the World, the life of Louis XIV?
Reading Saint-Simon, the great memoir writer, practically all my life, and the letters of Madame, his sister-in-law, who wrote very filthy, dirty and frank letters, often in German, to her relations in Germany about what's really going on at Versailles and what they're really doing.
You say filthy and dirty, what, sexual shenanigans?
Sexual and also lavatory humour, non-stop. She calls Madame de Maintenon, the king's second wife, a cunt or mouse droppings.
Louis XIV allegedly had an affectionate relationship with his mother, Queen Anne of Austria, who was regent of France after his father, Louis XIII, died when he was just 4.5. He was surrounded by towering and dominating individuals from the very start of his life. To what extent did this entourage and his early experiences contribute to his firm belief in the divine right of kings and centralised state government?
Well, he experienced this rebellion called the Fronde, and he had to leave Paris at night in 1649, and Parisians came to check he was in bed in 1651. So it was traumatic for him, and they were going from city to city, and sometimes rebellious cities shut their gates in his face.
Can you tell us a bit, background context, a bit about the rebellion, the Fronde?
The Fronde is a tax rebellion due to rising taxes in 1648. It's also hatred of the chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, who is very corrupt, and he's a foreigner. He's an Italian. And also, it is a genuine attempt to have a constitutional monarchy in France. A lot of French people genuinely wanted regular meetings of the States General and a more powerful Parlement de Paris, which was something like a Supreme Court, which was much trusted by Parisians to reduce their taxes. And the royal government, with this corrupt but extremely effective Cardinal Mazarin, looked pretty ropey to a lot of French people. Louis really knew provincial France. He went almost everywhere, the Dauphiné, as a young man and also on campaign as a mature man. And there were these provincial capitals with governors, sometimes with estates, with their own law courts, like Toulouse or Bordeaux or Lyon or Besançon, which remained quite important even under Louis XIV. What he had was Versailles, a job centre where you went begging the first official of the Ministry of War or something for a job, a promotion to be a colonel or a major, or to get a university for your home city. Or I found very good records of this sort of begging game. You were begging for a job, and then you could leave Versailles and go off and be commander of a garrison in Flanders or a judge in Navarre or something like that. So it wasn't totally centralised. There were more rivals to Paris than there were to London, I would say.
And back to the Fronde, he left because it was dangerous for him to be in... Well, I mean, he grew up in Versailles. Where did he grow up
No,
then?
he grew up...
His mother was regent and there was
his
Mazarin,
mother
but so
was
where did he grow up?
He grows up in Paris. As a young man, he's Parisian,
He's in Paris. Okay.
accessible. He's always in the Louvre or the Palais Royal.
So what kind of education did he have? Was
He had a
quite scholastic or quite worldly, practical, politics?
He has a very traditional Catholic education, lots of religion, lots of God, and then Latin. He translates Caesar's commentaries, or is said to. A bit of Italian, lots and lots of exercise. He's a 17th century royal gym rat. He's always playing tennis or swimming. Perfect body, everybody says, as perfect in body as he is in mind, and so on. He's no fool. He's also given Comines' memoirs to read, which are political memoirs of the 15th century about the struggle between France and Burgundy. Very cynical, very down to earth, not attributing everything to religion. And of course the best education of all was seeing the court, seeing people coming to see his mother and Mazarin, seeing what's really going on in Paris. This awful disillusion that cities could close their gates in face of the king.
So how was the Fronde resolved?
The Prince de Condé, who ended up as the leader of the Fronde, became overmighty. He kills people in Paris. He's unpopular in Paris. There are divisions among the Frondeurs. Mazarin withdraws to Cologne for a bit. And in the end, Paris wants the king back for business reasons and because they're fed up with these overmighty princes. So by October 1652, the king makes a triumphant entry into Paris. Beside him are two cousins, Prince Thomas of Savoy and the exiled Charles II of England. So he's already in the midst of European politics. And he tears up Parlement de Paris' records of the Fronde of the last 4 years, saying total amnesty, which in fact wasn't totally true because he does chop a few heads later for what they'd done during the Fronde. Paris and France are doing badly economically. Mazarin comes back. Everybody knows he's doing deals and feathering his nest. So there's still a lot of discontent.
So Louis XIV, takes over.
8 years after the Fronde ends in 1652. Mazarin dies early 1661.
So how old is Louis by this time?
So Louis is 23. Clever and extremely hard-working. Sometimes he worked till midnight. It's not all parties or wars. He's a real bureaucrat sitting at his desk, paperwork with ministers, determined to control everything. He's a control freak.
Right. His reign is marked by wars, with the Low Countries, Spain, territorial expansion, the colonies. How did he consolidate and govern?
As part of his education, he read accounts of the young Alexander the Great, and he was his hero. He wanted to be a new Alexander who had been a hereditary king of Macedon and then became a world emperor conquering to India. He was also very aware that England and Holland already seemed richer and ahead of France in global trade, so he wants to grab colonies and trade, including the slave trade. And he starts wars on Holland and on Spain. And
what kind of pretexts?
He says his wife, who's a Spanish infanta, should inherit half of Spain. He says Holland has insulted him. And then in 1688 he has this aggressive war towards Germany where he ravages the Rhineland in horrific circumstances, destroying Heidelberg and Speyer and Mannheim. He wants territory. He has a very strong sense of space as well as time. Time, he wants to have an immortal fame. Territory, he wants France to move to the east because already they're aware how easy it is to invade Paris, as French people found in June 1940 when the German army swept in about 2 weeks. So 4 weeks.
So how is, because there was the Treaty of Nimègue in the 1680s.
1678, the Treaty of Nimègue, he grabs a bit of the Spanish Netherlands, which is very roughly modern Belgium. Always this desire to push the French frontier north and east so that Paris is better defended. So Paris becomes a real centre of the kingdom. And he also pushes east and he grabs Strasbourg in 1681, one of the great achievements of the reign. For once, he's a statesman because he allows Alsace to keep its separate laws and, above all, religion. So they were Lutheran. While he's being Catholic in France proper, he allows Alsace to remain Lutheran. It's quite unusual.
It's because he also grabbed the Franche-Comté.
In 1676 to 8, because again he says his wife has a claim to Spanish territory, but really he's just trying to do what kings of France had always wanted to do, is push France east. Desire, in effect, to reach to the Rhine, a long-term French desire.
Tell us about the Huguenots.
This is one of the great blunders of his reign. He's perfectly pragmatic at some moments and in some fields, but after 1678 he gets God badly. He thinks he's got a direct line to God, and God is telling him to save the souls of the Protestants. And he increases persecution, which was already increasing slowly, and in 1685 he formally revokes the Edict of Nantes, which his grandfather, the great and good Henri IV, had granted full rights to Protestants in the Kingdom of France. He revokes it. They don't have the right to meet and pray together and worship. All priests have to leave. All Protestant churches are destroyed. Protestant schools, anything communal. And in theory, Protestants could go on living in France. In practice, they're locked up, in many cases killed, raped, pillaged, horrors beyond belief that you can't read about without thinking of the persecutions of the 20th century. I know it's anachronistic, but it's similar. Dying Protestants would put the Catholic host, in their mouths, so they died as Catholics. Protestants fleeing over the Alps, locals were encouraged to rob them and murder them to stop them fleeing, and they were rewarded with the possessions of the refugees. There were sales of Protestants' clothes, exactly like there were sales of Jews' clothes in Germany.
That is, religion, therefore, religion is there's almost like a fault line, because you again look at the Revolution, you look at the 19th century, and then even at the beginning of the 20th century, the separation of church and state. So would you say, even now, you said it was anachronistic, or perhaps it's not quite right, but having said which, the persecution of both of Jews, but also of the hatred of Islam, does that sort of fall into the French psyche, if you like? There's always been a fault line in France. We see it's coming through the revolution.
I think there's a cult of the state. The cult of the state and state power and uniformity is maybe stronger in France than in some other countries. And by the way, the flight of the Huguenots, which is illegal, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, they were allowed to take their possessions. Even the Spanish government gave them ships occasionally. It was all quite peaceful compared to what happened in France. And people were well aware of it, and they didn't really criticize it, except in the safety of their attic. Saint-Simon writes magnificent passages about the persecution of the Protestants. And there's a famous, but unfortunately apocryphal remark attributed to de Gaulle, who said, if Louis XIV had not revoked the Edict of Nantes, maybe the first man on the moon would have spoken French. And because these very clever minority of 150,000 or so craftsmen, writers, future diplomats, jewelers, watchmakers, scientific instrument makers, they all flee, and where do they go? To the capitals of France's enemies, Amsterdam, Berlin and London. It's then that London overtakes Paris in terms of size, modernity and sort of economic toughness.
All the Huguenots came over here and settled east.
A huge immigration, yes.
And they were
20,000 maybe.
Particularly, was it the rag trade?
Yes, silk makers.
Silk makers, that's right.
But also it's then that English clocks and guns become better than French clocks and guns, technically. And a lot of diplomats weaving alliances between Louis XIV's enemies. They're in fact Huguenots, speaking French, the language of Europe, bringing William III together with Brandenburg, together with Denmark, together with... and also joining armies and navies against France.
So continuing with the monstrosities, And his reign also marks really the beginning of the sort of French slave trade proper, if one could
Yes.
call that, colonising Senegal, Martinique, Guadeloupe, slave ships treating humans in a monstrously inhuman way.
Yes.
That started under him. I mean, how could he possibly even justify such a thing?
Money, it's just money. His ambassador in Madrid, when France is trying to grab the Spanish slave trade as well as its own, he writes, "Ce commerce est très avantageux." This trade is very advantageous. It's simply about money. Cheap labour for the sugar plantations and coffee plantations of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and above all Saint-Domingue, what is now Haiti, which has the best coffee in the world in the 18th century, and that helps build these glorious buildings in Bordeaux and Nantes, which you can still see today.
And also Haiti has the worst track record of all the Caribbean islands, of the worst abuses and monstrosities that were committed. Louis' globalism took in Siam, which of course is now
Thailand,
and China. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, characteristically in Siam, there is exchange of embassies. There are wonderful pictures of Siamese in full Siamese dress, kowtowing to Louis XIV in the Galerie des Glaces, 1686, 1688. But characteristically, he overreached himself. He wanted to grab Bangkok as a French base and trading base, rivalry with the Dutch. He wants all Siam to convert, and the King of Siam gives him a lesson in tolerance. He says, if God wanted everybody to worship him in the same way, he wouldn't create so many different people, religions, animals and plants. He said God obviously likes diversity. So it's Asia giving a lesson to Europe. And then there is a local reaction against French bullying and land grab. There's a rising, the king is deposed and imprisoned, the French are thrown out, and for the next century and a half, Siam closes in on itself.
And what about China?
And China, there's 1684, I think the first Chinese visitor to Versailles. Now there are millions every year. You see them in queues. Comes to Versailles in a beautiful green tunic with a blue vest. He was called Michael Shen Feng, and he was a convert to Catholicism. He's brought by a Jesuit minder, and he eats Chinese food with chopsticks on a gold plate in front of the royal family. They're fascinated. And Louis XIV is so curious, he refuses to have a kowtow to himself. He just wants to talk through this Jesuit interpreter. And then there's the Jesuits, being a highly learned order. Mathematicians and astronomers are sent all the way to Beijing by French boats. France is becoming slowly a global power. And there's this Jesuit mission in Beijing which thinks it can convert the emperor to Catholicism. Again, this overconfidence, and thinks it can blend, or the word they used was accommodate, Confucianism and ancestor worship with Catholicism. And then the Pope says no in about 1707, and the whole thing sort of peters out. But they're there, they're talking, they're exchanging gifts, they're publishing wonderful descriptions of Siam and China. So these first early descriptions, long before the English, the first proper modern maps of China are drawn by French Jesuits and printed in Paris in the 1730s.
Did Europe, as we know it today, exist in the 17th century?
Well, there's no Brussels or European Commission, but there are these congresses of diplomats meeting, very conscious of the peace of Europe, everybody speaking French or Latin as international languages, and beginnings of international law, exchange of prisoners, diplomats' rights, properly marked frontiers. And Louis XIV has this very interesting secretary called Monsieur de Callière, who says at the end of the reign, oh, well, Europe's just one great republic. The states are so linked that you cannot separate the interests of one state from another. And they have this attempt to have peace and regular meetings between France, England, the Netherlands, the Habsburg monarchy, Spain.
Where did they meet? They moved
They
from
would
city
meet
to city, or how did it work?
in the Peace of Utrecht, 1713. Then there were congresses in Soissons or Cambrai or Aix. But of course it peters out. Traditional rivalry between France and Austria, traditional rivalry between France and England, which becomes stronger with the trying to grab the world trade in sugar and spices.
So the relationship between France and England is like an old couple who fight and divorce and then get back together again for a period of domestic bliss. So how was this reflected in the reign of Louis XIV? They were together and then they fought? Or, I mean, how did that
It's
manifest?
Extremely complex and electrifying relationship. There's always tension. First of all, Louis XIV's aunt, Henrietta Maria, daughter of Henri IV, marries Charles I. There's a very close family link between the Stuarts and the Bourbons. Secondly, London and Paris are the two biggest, most glamorous royal capitals in Europe. They're quite close to each other, so there's a constant va-et-vient of people, ideas, objects, trade. The English come to Paris during the Civil War to escape, like John Evelyn and others. The French go to London to escape Richelieu's tyranny, and then the Huguenots going after 1685. So lots of London is, in fact, French-speaking. The elite speak French. I think Queen Anne and her husband, Prince George of Denmark, spoke to each other in French. It was sort of automatic. And there's a loving relationship before 1688 with England and France together attacking the Netherlands in 1672. The great Duke of Marlborough, the great general, begins in the French army, not the English army. And then 1688, William III becomes king, the Glorious Revolution. From then on, there is a war relationship between the two countries, fueled by Protestantism and Catholicism, desire for colonies, and desire to make Europe safe from France, to stop French expansion. But when there's peace, 1697 to 1782, as happened in the 19th century, thousands of English people flood to Paris, fascinated by Paris, Versailles, and so on. And people laughed at Versailles sometimes, but they also loved it. And there's a famous remark later by Lord Chesterfield saying, an hour at Versailles is worth more than 3 hours in a study with the best books.
Palace of Versailles, how did he put the stamp of absolutism on it, and how did he develop it? Because kings used to be in Paris. I mean, they moved to Versailles.
They were always, the kings of France were always moving around, always a bit frightened of Paris because it's so big and explosive, and always loving hunting forests. So there's Chambord, the great Renaissance chateau, Fontainebleau in the middle of forests, so you can go hunting deer. So Versailles is just a 17th century expansion on the idea of a hunting palace. And of course there had been the Escorial of Louis's ancestor, Philip II of Spain. But he inherits his father's small hunting lodge at Versailles. He makes it something unique and personal. This is my palace.
So that's his great legacy.
Bigger than...
He builds it.
He builds it from 1664 to 1688. A huge... And what's odd is there's a central block, royal block, king's apartment, queen's apartment. That's quite standard. But then two other equally large blocks for his cousins and his courtiers. So there's about 180 apartments in Versailles, let alone small rooms for other people, and rooms in other buildings in the town of Versailles.
Almost like a village in itself.
It's like a village in itself.
And what about Le Nôtre?
Le Nôtre, and he designs these wonderful gardens with infinite views, and really the whole area around Paris becomes a huge park with statues, fountains, avenues, perspectives, linking Versailles, Marly, Saint-Germain, Saint-Cloud, Fontainebleau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, and so on. And the best side of Louis is really his treatment of artists. He is extremely creative himself. He helps design, he inspires writers, and Le Nôtre is allowed to go around the Garden of Versailles in a sort of wheelchair next to the king in his wheelchair, king and gardener almost as equals. It's a huge honour for the time.
He benefited from the brilliance of extraordinary,
Yes.
An array of its figures. André Charles Boulle, that's extraordinary furniture he made. Molière, Racine, Boileau, La Fontaine, Lully, Marais, Lebrun, Rigaud, Bossuet, Levaux, Mansart, Charles-Claude Perrault, and then Le Nôtre. I mean, and many others. I mean, where do they all sort of appeared? How did all that come together?
Anyway, there would always have been brilliant writers, and he picks them, and some of them are in his household anyway as reader or valet de chambre, and he inspires them. He wants constant novelty, more plays from Molière and Racine. Racine reads to him at night when he's ill. They get on very well. It's quite a close relationship. And he said to Racine once, "I would praise you more if you didn't praise me so much." Molière criticises Catholic piety in Tartuffe, which was played before Louis XIV. And there's also, it's quite licentious. There's lots of plays, Les Plaisirs de l'Amour. You must enjoy them while you can. You don't get them as often as you think. And Racine has lines about giving up love for duty, which refers to an early love affair of Louis XIV with Marie Mancini. He says, always in Rome, the country must come before personal inclinations. And they're secretly even more critical. Racine is really a Jansenist, which was a very austere Catholic group which rejected the authority of the church in some cases.
So the Jansenists and the Jesuits,
they were enemies. They were enemies.
Yeah.
The Jesuits were more accommodating. The Jansenists were extremely austere. It's a form of opposition, yes. And Louis XIV persecuted them almost as much as he persecuted the Huguenots.
Louis XIV and his women.
A key aspect and quite original. A treatise on the equality of the sexes was published in Paris in 1673, and it has the double L monogram in laced L's on the frontispiece, on the title page, and it's published avec privilège du roi. So it's with his blessing, and he has this rather terrifying school teacher, second wife, Madame de Maintenon, who's very keen on women's education. And they found together the school of Saint-Cyr in 1686, near Versailles, where 200 or 300 poor noble women are educated, were given a proper education, though always underneath Madame de Maintenon, who herself is extremely privileged, given chateau and money.
Where was the first wife and the second wife? So
the first wife was this Spanish infanta. She was sidelined, and he treated her appallingly. He made her travel in the same carriage as his mistresses and so on.
And who are his mistresses?
His mistresses are a young woman called Louise de la Vallière, one of the best horsewomen at the French court, and then later the Marquise de Montespan from the high court nobility.
Famous Marquise de
who
Montespan.
Makes him laugh and entertains him. And unfortunately, I haven't found their love letters. One day I hope to do so. And they were intercepted by the Austrians, and they say they're completely disgusting. And what's most disgusting is that he talks about his campaigns with her as if she's a military advisor. So I think sort of taking fortresses and taking Madame de Montespan sort of blended in his mind. And I think this shows the key to his personality. He's always thinking about power. He's a control freak, even with this adored mistress on whom he lavishes every form of jewelry and presents and property.
So how did she exit and the wife?
She exits, she becomes fat. She has a lot of children by him. It was said...
How many children? Yes, do we know how many children?
Well, about 8 or 9, because there were a lot of miscarriages and stillbirths. It was said of her that her powder ignited quickly. So she's exhausted by childbirth. She becomes fat. He loses interest. 1678.
And how come he hadn't married her?
Because his wife is alive.
Yes, of course.
It's
the Spanish.
Coterminous. But she hangs on at court and gets her children quite well established. And she has a terrible temper. Even when she's in retirement, running a girls' school, another girls' school, a sort of convent school for young seamstresses, the ladies of the convent complain of her terrible temper.
The affair of the poisons.
Yes.
So
Madame de
that
Montespan
was
is
Madame de
involved.
Montespan, that's
She
right.
probably had...
What was that?
No one quite knows,
Famous
because a
scandal.
lot of the confessions may have been false confessions. Her lady's maid went to a famous French sorceress and bought love potions, as was quite common then. But that may have been love potions to make the king only love her and dismiss Louise la Vallière. But that may have been and also a lot of consulting astrologers and sorcerers. But it may have been no more than that, or it may have been real attempts to poison in other cases. But I don't believe Madame de Montespan was involved. And Anne Somerset says it was the king's mind rather than his body that was poisoned. It may have been a plot by Louvois to remove or to intimidate powerful court nobles. Some husbands of other women in Paris.
Oh, husbands, so it wasn't women, it wasn't rival.
It was women poisoning husbands or other women.
So it wasn't women poisoning each other, it was the husbands being poisoned.
Yes. Please remember women in the 17th century had a very strong role. It could be perfectly aggressive. Madame de Maintenon, good as gold.
Where does she
is she's a convert from Protestantism, a ropey family. Her father had been in prison and she lived off charity. She's extremely clever, very good company, and Madame de Montespan chooses her to be her children's governess. The person who you don't really pay that much attention to is in fact the most powerful rival of all, more powerful than other court ladies, because she's very polite, never loses her temper, and the king begins to enjoy her conversation, and then maybe something more, and he makes her Marquise de Maintenon. He gives her a chateau. He helps design her park at Maintenon, which is still there, west of Versailles, always in the same area.
And then he marries her.
And then he almost certainly, there's no actual record, but contemporaries think he marries her in October 1683. She's not of the right rank. He had stopped his first cousin, La Grande Mademoiselle, from marrying Monsieur de Lauzun, who's a noble, but he allows himself to marry a noble woman, a woman who's barely noble. She'd married a rackety poet called Paul Scarron.
Okay. And Madame de Montespan, she just disappears into the quiet, some apartment in Versailles. She's shunted in the back room. What happens to her?
She leaves in the early 1690s. She goes to Paris and runs this convent school for young seamstresses.
So she just exits the stage, really.
She's not even invited to the weddings of her children by the king.
Philippe de France, brother of Louis XIV, was known to have a preference for men, even though he was married twice and fathered various children. Was homosexuality tolerated in 17th century France? What were the king's views on this?
The king didn't like it.
Right.
Maybe one of Mazarin's nephews had made an attempt on him when he was young. There were rumours about that. The king hated it, and he said to Monsieur's lover, the Chevalier de Lorraine, "No, you cannot join the royal hunt because you hunt other game than I do." In Paris, people were burnt for it, for sodomy and other crimes. In the 1670s, it was totally forbidden. But at the court followed different laws. The court gambled, and the court was called in 1682 La Petite Sodome, because young men, and then Madame, who's married to the king's, young men were up to it, and they were exiled from court, and Madame, who, the wife of the king's gay brother, she says everyone's doing it. She becomes obsessed with it. She thought everybody in England was doing it.
England? Right.
England and France and Versailles. In the end, the king accepts his brother's relationship with the Chevalier de Lorraine because he wanted his brother's son to marry his illegitimate daughter, a bastard. Quite a social revolution.
Illegitimate? Now, what was that?
The king's illegitimate daughter by Madame de Montespan, Mademoiselle de Blois, marries his brother's son.
What was the
No, he wanted his daughter to be well established, to become a royal highness, a princess. And the king's brother's lover puts pressure on his brother, and he agrees.
And is it not Monsieur Frère du Roi who used to ride to battle in dresses?
No, he didn't.
That a rumour?
He did dress as a woman at balls when he was young. He rode probably with a breastplate and ordinary clothes, but highly made up, as if he was going to a ball.
So he was rouged and...
Yes, rouged to kill.
Rouged to kill. And wasn't he a brilliant strategist?
He did win a great battle at Kassel, 1677, and the king hesitated in battles. He liked grand sieges, which proceeded in a very orderly fashion, with the predictable result of the French winning and not too many soldiers dying. I think he was a bit of hesitant about the battle.
Whereas the brother
wasn't.
Went for it. No.
And after his victory in 1677, he never got another active command because the king was jealous. I think all that is true, although he was used as an intermediary with Savoy, for example, and he was sent to inspect the coastal defences in the west in the 1690s. So he's not sidelined, but the king is certainly jealous of better generals in the family.
And you've mentioned Levallois, so that was the ongoing partner of the brother.
The Chevalier de Lorraine.
Not Levallois.
One of them.
Lorraine.
There was
Robert,
also
he was a favourite.
He was the favourite. Also the Marquis d'Effiat,
okay.
And many others. And Madame is. They buy and sell boys at the opera like horses.
Court life in a day in the life of Louis XIV. We had Le Roi se lève.
Lots of very clever, ambitious people together in the same space. So he gets up, he prays. People are at the levee, asking for a look, looking at the king, wanting just even a glance. They've come from Paris often, so the courtyard is full of carriages. Then he has a very light breakfast. Then he goes to Mass in the finest room of all in Versailles, the chapel, 1710, absolutely magnificent. And the king sits right opposite the high altar, and people in the congregation are often looking at the king, not at the altar, of course. The king and his family. And on his way to chapel, people will petition him for jobs or money or favours or anything. So it's this great central employment exchange. Then he has a meeting of the council in the late morning. Then he has a dinner in public, much too much to eat. So he has rather bad health because he's tempted with all these dishes. But it's a way for people to traipse past him and often to talk to him. Racine would talk to him, or travellers talk to him about Siam or Persia or India. People would come just to look. Then in the afternoon he might go hunting. He adored hunting and shooting, or shooting in the Petit Parc, where pheasants are bred for him, like today. Or gardening with Lenôtre, new perspectives, new avenues, placing statues. He's placing statues in his garden, even at the age of 78. And then in the evening, dinner, theatre, and then working with ministers, individual ministers, till midnight often.
Why is he known as a Sun King?
Oh, that's later. It's in the 19th century. It's just a theatrical description. But he
wasn't known at the time.
No,
So
he's Le Grand Monarch.
Le Grand Monarch.
And he chooses the sun as his emblem. And because the sun's rays are beneficent and universal.
Well, which brings us to how did he actually handle power? Did he go mad or just become very incompetent and arrogant? He had the longest, 72 years and 100 days, 110 days is the longest recorded of any monarch of a sovereign country in European history.
Yep.
I mean, that was a long reign. How did it change him? How did he evolve?
He's quite a modest young man. He lets Mazarin rule the roost, even when he's in his 20s. So that's quite unusual, really.
But you also said he was a control freak.
It comes later. He's very gentle and respectful to women by the standards of the age, particularly to his mother. Later, with power, he becomes quite cruel. He's cruel to Fouquet, who has solitary confinement, the disgraced finance minister. I think there's some personal edge. We don't know. Maybe about women. He uses Fouquet's design team at Vaux, at Versailles, and I think he made these interlaced L's that are everywhere at Versailles. I think it may be imitated from the interlaced F's of Fouquet, which were even on his book bindings.
Well, was it a power? Or did he feel...
He wanted...
didn't like to be threatened, for example, by the brother. Was Fouquet threatening to him in some way?
Yes, because Fouquet had his own networks, even in the College of Cardinals in Rome. He was too big for his boots.
And his what was Fouquet's palace garden?
It's this very beautiful chateau at Vaux, finished in 1661 for a wonderful party for the king. A catastrophic party that was too grand, too beautiful, too well organised.
Oh, so he felt threatened.
Yes. And then he has these competing ministers balancing Colbert and Louvois and Philippot, so that he gets information from different sources, so he knows what's really going on. He listened all the time. Even Saint-Simon, who hated him, says if you had an audience with him, he would listen if it was said in the right way. And Madame de Maintenon criticises him, at least in her letters to other people. She didn't like war. They know perfectly well there's famine in the country.
He became very controlling.
And very cruel. This mild young man, who's thought to be gentle, who forgives the rebellion of the Fronde. He destroys these German cities. He destroys Algiers. He bombards and burns Brussels. And there's this...
Rule by fear. In a way, he used fear as a weapon.
Or he thinks he doesn't follow the rules of war which are being established, and he thinks it's going to terrify people into obedience, quite wrongly. It's slightly like the bombing campaign of the Second World War. He says, ordering the bombardment of Brussels, that's including Catholic churches, though he's the Christian king, etc. He says, il faut faire quelque chose d'éclat. We've got to do something impressive. And then there's this pamphlet written at the time, a letter from the devil to the King of France, complaining. The devil complains, oh, you're taking my job away. There's nothing left for the devil to do. You're so diabolical. And the cruelty to Protestants, cruelty even to Jansenist nuns, old ladies of 80 who were thrown out of their convent. It's this lack of discipline or control, and it's Mazarin and his mother were not personally cruel. It's himself. Yes. And it helps unite Europe against him. It helps unite German opinion and English opinion against him. They all know what the Huguenots are going through. Lots of pamphlets about it. His grandson, Philip V, is actually quite popular in Spain. The Allies cannot remove him. The Spanish army wins victories. The French army is more resilient than people think. He's built 80 forts, which delay Marlborough's advance on Paris. All along the frontiers, you can visit this wonderful fort at Lille called La Reine des Citadelles.
All around the sort of edge of France.
Yes. The Fort de Joux, and some of them were even still being used in the Maginot Line. They were so well built. Every single French frontier town and along the Pyrenees, vast expense, but some of them work. England is fed up with war. Queen Anne wants peace, wants an end to bloodshed, and she sacks Marlborough. He keeps most of his conquests, Flanders, Franche-Comté, Alsace, the great city of Strasbourg, but he has abandoned Luxembourg, the valley of the Mosel, a fortress in the Italian Alps, Pinerolo, which would have given him access to Italy. So France has begun to retreat.
What was he like as a father?
Well, very loving. He adored his family. He wants his illegitimate daughters always with him. His son always with him. He doesn't like his son not being at
So how many legitimate versus illegitimate?
He only had one surviving legitimate son and 3 illegitimate children. No, the son, the Dauphin, dies.
The Dauphin dies.
It's his great-grandson who's Louis XV.
Oh, it's his great-grandson who was...
There's a hecatomb of the royal family, partly caused by the bad doctors chosen by Louis XIV. So Dr. Fagon. Even his doctors were bad.
So So he had bad choice about human beings and people around him. Now, what was that? His pride? They flattered him. He believed what they said. What was that?
He wanted safe, familiar faces. The Maréchal de Villeroy, who's trounced the Ramillies. Chamillard, who's a favourite billiard partner, who is given the impossible task of being both finance and war minister.
So his daughters survived, you're saying? How many of his children then survived?
3 illegitimate daughters survived him, yes.
So one of them marries the brother's son. What about the other two?
The other one marries the Prince de Conti, a cousin, and the other one marries the Duc de Bourbon, a cousin, a mad royal dwarf who thought he was a dog. He started barking sometimes. They were given these grand royal weddings, and they would squabble sometimes, screaming at each other, "Oh, you're just a wine sack," or "Oh, you're just a slut. You've had every guards officer in
So very colourful,
the court."
direct language.
Yes, when they got going, yes.
And
Very grand, majestic on the dance floor.
So the grandson was who became Louis XV.
Great-grandson.
Great-grandson.
Because even
his
parents,
what happened? Who were his parents?
they died of a form of measles. They were the children of the Dauphin, the Duc de Bourgogne, and his brilliant wife, who the king adored, the Duchesse de Bourgogne. They suddenly died. Bad treatment, and the son suddenly died. An extreme form of measles called rougeole. And even the king could have survived if he'd had better treatment.
So, because what got him in the end?
Gout and gangrene. His courtiers insisted on doctors being brought from Paris instead of the court doctors, because nobody trusted Dr. Fajon.
Well, the legacy today.
The French is a world language. In Africa, it all begins, and the Middle East, it begins under Louis XIV. This image of grandeur and Versailles, Versailles is still used. Foreign state visits.
Today, yes.
Almost every evening there's a special event, cultural or a trade promotion or a private party, Indian millionaires marrying their children at Versailles. It's so, the brand is stronger than ever. So it's still packing them in for France.
And how have French presidents used it?
The Senate and the Chamber of Deputies still has a room in Versailles, because Versailles was again capital of France in the 1870s in reaction against the Commune. Presidents like Macron, who has a sense of grandeur, they use it to impress foreign visitors like Putin, or to hold joint sessions of the Parliament in this Salle du Congrès. And the presidents also have this rather lovely La Lanterne, it's called, a private house in the park of Versailles, which Sarkozy liked very much. And de Gaulle used to use the Grand Trianon for receiving foreign state visitors. And it's 7 or 8 million visitors a year, depending on whether you include the park as well as the chateau. The most visited palace in the world, apart from the Forbidden City of his admiring fellow monarch, the Chinese emperor.
Paris during the rule of Louis XIV, how often did
It's
he
very,
go
very
Paris?
interesting. He, as a young man, he's a Parisian. He lives a lot in the Louvre till about 1666, when his mother dies there. And that seems to have been a trigger for him neglecting it increasingly. After 1671...
In the Louvre, his mother dies.
Yes.
Okay.
1671, he never spends another night in Paris. He adores the country. But it doesn't mean he neglects Paris. He has created this new post, Lieutenant de Police de Paris, and he receives these reports, working late at night. Has the lackey of the Savoy ambassador behaved insolently? Are the English behaving badly in the cafes of the Rue Jacob? Can we have lists of suspect English and loyal English? Who's doing what are homosexuals doing in the Jardin des Tuileries even then? He knows everything that's happening, and he has these reforms. Street lighting before London, the magnificent east facade of the Louvre, that is Louis XIV.
The Louvre then was a palace?
It was a palace, but
who lived there?
Court officials, the court, but increasingly...
So it's like a sub-power centre to
or a real power centre. Increasingly it's used by academicians, meetings, hanging exhibitions of paintings.
So the idea of it being a museum began then?
Yes, it's already then.
It began then, or it began
Well, already there'd been a display of the classical antiquities owned by the king, buying antiquities from Rome and Italy, and indeed being offered La Venus d'Arles, the wonderful antiquities found in Provence or elsewhere in France, and they're on show in the Galerie des Glaces in Versailles. So court workshops, the Royal Printing Press, the Boule's workshop, they're all in the Louvre, which is free of guild restrictions. So it's quite good for craftsmen. Even Colbert, the great Colbert, his greatest minister, he had an idea to make it a global palace with an Eastern room, a Chinese room, showing the wonders of the world in the Louvre already. And he also has quite good police in Paris.
Paris then, of course, the Wend, that was much later in the 19th century, or the sweeping boulevards. It was a collection of little tiny streets, almost rather medieval, really, and
yes,
almost like villages.
Very medieval, very dirty. But he begins some boulevard by taking down the walls and planting trees. The Boulevard des Italiens.
And what about the Tuileries existed?
The Tuileries is expanded under him. He lives there a bit from 1666 to 1671. And he builds this wonderful military city, the Hôtel des Invalides, which is really enormous, with 14 courtyards, which you don't often go into now. The Gilded Dome inspires de Gaulle when he's returning to Paris in August 1944. He talks about the splendour of the Sun King reflected in the Invalides. And there's also another place, much more functional, again extraordinary architecture, called La Salpêtrière, which is a huge hospital begun in the 1650s with a very austere central chapel. Really quite wonderful, functional architecture. Really, it's to put fallen women or ill women there. And it's from there that people called les filles du roi, or the king's daughters, i.e. ex-prostitutes, are shipped to Quebec to try and get the population up. The hospitals are founded in different French towns, but it's partly to control the poor rather than to heal them.
And what about illness and disease and plague?
It's a catastrophe at the end of his reign. 1693, 1709, hundreds of thousands of people dying, but a lot of medical advances, dissection. Paris as a scientific capital, as a capital of knowledge of the outside world, of the Middle East. And the first edition of the 1001 Nights is printed in Paris in French. The Observatoire, which is still there, is established by Louis XIV. A huge legacy, yes.
Of the World, The Life of Louis XIV, published by Penguin on 11th of July. It's all in there. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.